Thank you very much again. And we move on to Sam. Sam is a lecturer in criminology at the University of West London. His interests include gender, extremism, and counterterrorism. And his research currently investigates freedom of information and counterterrorism policy and digital identities and extremism. Floor is yours. And thank you for your patience.
No problem. I'll just try and get my PowerPoint up correctly. How does that show for everyone? Good. Okay,
Shows
cool.
good, yeah, yeah.
Great.
Nice big purple block. That's
Exactly. There's a big purple
It's my
block
favorite
under male
PowerPoint.
loneliness, video gaming, and extremism. And behind the purple, who knows what's behind the purple block now?
It's a placeholder of some wonderful picture I haven't found yet.
Well done for honesty.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me. It was really interesting, Edvin, your presentation just now as well, especially seeing as you talked about this idea of alienation and loneliness, perhaps appearing through the life course of your character, the incel, and also some of the other stuff that people have spoken about today, especially talking about the extreme language online in gaming spaces and the prevalence of misogyny, for instance, being one of the things that most commonly comes along. So those things are going to appear in this presentation bit by bit. I'm mostly looking at male loneliness and how that fits in with video gaming and how that fits in with extremism. But really, this is part of a kind of wider project of looking at gender in video gaming spaces. And I'm just focusing in on male loneliness as a particular subset of loneliness within this space because separating them out is sometimes easier. And I'll get to why that is in a moment. So just as a summary of what I'm going to talk about, the first thing that's probably worth pointing out is that a lot of this research and a lot of these ideas are drawing on recent discourse about this idea that there's a male loneliness epidemic, and that especially in the Western world, men are becoming increasingly lonely. They're spending more and more time alone. They have fewer social connections, and that this is some kind of social problem or even a public health problem. Whether that's true or not, we'll get to in a moment. But that's certainly a piece of discourse that's appeared quite prominently, not only in the media, but also in government policy. And there have been a lot of commissions. In fact, there was a commission in the UK looking at loneliness as a public health problem. This fits in as well with our ideas stereotypically about gamers, especially historically, being young, lonely men, the kind of guys who just stay in their room all day and play video games and don't ever meet anyone. So the two things have a kind of natural synergy. And also what fits in with that are the general norms we have around masculinity. I'll look at those in a moment, but in general, we find that men are not very good at seeking help, and that when they get frustrated, when they get lonely, it can encourage some of the more toxic traits of masculinity. Finally, there's a synergy between loneliness and support for extremism as well. And we'll look at some of the data for that in a moment. But one of the things that links all these together is the idea that video gaming is basically a coping strategy that people engage in for loneliness. And it's something that they can do that can have positive effects or it can have negative effects. And that within the video gaming communities, I probably don't need to say this too much now after everyone's spoken today, but there are bad actors who are going to take advantage of vulnerable people. So it creates this kind of pile-on effect of there's lonely guys and they have trouble seeking help, and they might video game for coping behaviors, and there's people who are looking for people with these traits and trying to select them and try to radicalize them or otherwise recruit them. And then finally, it fits in with this historic problem of sexism, homophobia. And the question I was trying to look at is what roles of video gaming or video games, what roles do video games play with this entire dynamic? So first, we'll have a quick look at loneliness, what loneliness is. And some of the basic concepts that we can think of is that loneliness is this painful awareness that we have a social desire or a social need that's not being met. It could be something to do with belonging, companionship, friendship, love, admiration, attention, any of these things that we want socially that somehow we feel aren't being fulfilled. What's kind of important about this as well is that this is a subjective feeling. So it differentiates from actual social isolation, which would be objective, saying that someone just never meets anyone else, versus the feeling of being alone, which you can experience perhaps in a marriage or a relationship, where you might see someone every day, you're not actually alone, but you feel like you have no connection there. And this has both social and individual elements to it. Individually, we've got a lot of data that says it results in mental health problems, poor emotional regulation, but it also reduces social trust and makes people more anxious and creates this kind of self-preservation mindset, which is important for the social side of things. There's a bunch of philosophical literature, which I find really interesting as well, which links loneliness to ressentiment, and basically says that when people become lonely, they become more likely to, when that's not resolved, externalize that loneliness onto some other cause. And if they're feeling particularly powerless to overcome that cause, they can engage a moral system which allows them to take perhaps immoral actions. So then that leads to these ideas that there's perhaps social elements to this as well. And it's kind of important for this research to recognize that loneliness is a social phenomenon. It rests on the fact that you have that feeling of something that's not being met. And that feeling engages with what you expect from your life, what you expect should be fulfilled, your role in society, and so on. So, for instance, the very basic example might be that if you're a mother, you might be bringing upon yourself certain social expectations of what your children should be emotionally offering you. And if you're not getting that, you can begin to feel lonely. So there are all these different structures that it draws on, but importantly, it's both individual and social. This relates quite a lot to masculinity. I mentioned at the start that men are particularly bad at help seeking. But if we just reverse to thinking about what masculinity is in its most kind of core element, we have these ideas of traditional masculinity. And there's a lot of different literature around this, and I've just taken the masculine norms inventory just as an illustrative example, which says that masculinity is about winning, it's about emotional self-control, it's about taking risks, it's about dominating, it's about being a playboy, about being self-reliant, about having power over women and pursuing status. And what that really feeds into when we're thinking about loneliness is that men have this tendency to think that it's good to be independent, that they shouldn't be vulnerable, that they shouldn't feel like they need other people. And so what that leads to, in theory, and there's a lot of data again to support this, is that when men feel lonely, they begin to generate that resentment. They begin to think, oh, well, this is something which is violating my personal sense of being, and I can't admit it, because if I admit it, then I admit that I'm not fulfilling masculine norms. And then that's going to further violate my being. And so they have a tendency to either come in on themselves or externalize it in difficult and socially destructive ways. I did mention that there's some kind of data and differences around whether there is actually a male loneliness epidemic. And the data actually says it's about the same for men and women, at least the data we have around the Western world. But what we see about men is that they have a greater tendency to say that they're disconnected from their social groups, they're disconnected from their friends, they don't have intimate friendships, and that they rely a lot on romantic relationships in order to not feel alone. And one thing that we do know is that despite the fact that there tends to be an equal balance in loneliness between men and women, the group that's most at risk of feeling lonely, interestingly for us, are actually the kind of young emerging adults who are male. So men who are between the ages of, say, 18 to 26 are those who are most likely to report feeling alone out of all the different cohorts. there's a lot of data as well to say that this intersects with extremism. There's been quite a few studies on this, but there's been kind of a flora of studies that have come out recently on this too, because there's been increased interest in the idea that loneliness might fuel extremism. And all of these studies that have read have supported the idea that people who are lonely are more likely to support extremist political parties, to support the radical right, to express extreme ideas. And that also fits in with those kind of new salad bar extremisms that we've been talking about today. And there's data to say that those people who are lonely are also more likely to just generally be hostile to the world and generally feel like they want to burn everything down, just kind of leaning into that kind of nihilistic extremism that we might be thinking about. So there's a lot of statistically significant data that says that you're more likely to be extremist if you are feeling alone, and that just in general is going to give you that idea that the world is leaving you behind. All of that is, of course, shaped by the entirety of your values, the entirety of your identity. So again, if we kind of flip back to the idea that gender is going to really shape our social being, then the position that you find yourself in the world, the identity as a man that you take, is then going to structure how you deal with loneliness. And if you deal with it poorly and you're more likely to shift towards extreme attitudes, then there's a higher likeliness as well that you're going to engage with those more toxic traits of masculinity. You're more likely to see violence as justified. You're more likely to see that you as an individual have to do something. This graph, bunch of boxes on the right-hand side is taken from a very interesting paper by two researchers, Tierkonen and Tietjen. And actually, they looked at some data on extremist manifestos, and two people that we've been talking about today, Elliot Rodger and Brenton Tarrant, included in their study. And interestingly, both those actors, I'm sure as we all know, repeatedly talk about how loneliness has influenced their pathway towards their final act of violence. We have Elliot Rodger talking a number of times in his manifesto. I think they actually counted the amount of times he included the word lonely, and it's an excessive amount of times talking about how he feels left behind by the world, how he feels alone, how he feels there's no way out of it. And Brenton Tarrant talking about a trip that he takes to, I believe it was Paris, and in his mind, watching lots of non-white people enjoying themselves, having full families, having full lives, and the white people that he sees just kind of in his mind wandering around alone. And that in this narrative to him is kind of a precursor to him thinking, again, there has to be something that we have to do about this. And that fits in this most leftmost box there under agency, talking about loneliness related to the lack of intimacy with a sense of existential threat. Of course, I'm talking mostly about men here as well. So just to think about, if we think about women within this framework, their framework of dealing with this kind of phenomena is likely to be different because of their gendered expectations and also the way that they just interact with each other in the world. And they're more likely to experience loneliness instead because of perhaps oppression that they experience. Maybe that's domestic violence, or maybe that's kind of economic oppression, but also that's going to fit in with the way that they try to deal with it. One way that people do try to deal with it is via seeking distraction. And one of the mediums that is both traditionally thought to be something that lonely people seek out as a way of seeking distraction and managing their stress is video gaming. And video gaming, is shown in the literature to be good at managing stress. I mean, this is not something I want to say, hey, this is terrible. No, I think we do all need to recognize that video games have a lot of good to offer the world because they offer people enjoyment, they offer people opportunities for socialization, they offer ways of managing our stress. We all have daily stresses in our lives, and we seek to find ways to alleviate that. And video games are a very effective way of alleviating that. but it can be positive or negative. And there's literature as well on loneliness and video gaming, and specifically on how people might use video games to alleviate loneliness, and whether this is good or bad, and also whether excessive video game usage might lead to loneliness too. So we are looking at this from a kind of stepwise perspective, from the position of people get lonely, and then perhaps they seek out video gaming, and then what does that do? But also we can look at it from the other way, that perhaps people weren't lonely, but they excessively video gamed, and that led to something else. So it's kind of a more of a cyclical, theoretical model. Anyway, those people who are lonely can seek out video games as a way of alleviating that, and that can actually have good positive effects. There's positive effects on loneliness when people use video games as a social medium explicitly. If they feel lonely and they look for ways to socialize, and they look at video gaming, online video gaming, or LAN centers, even as we've discussed today, as a way to alleviate that, that's associated with less loneliness in the future. However, if you use video gaming as a way of disengaging from the world because you find it too stressful, if you use video gaming to try and forget your loneliness, you're more likely to become more lonely. And then if you continue to do this, you might find that your social contact begins to shrink, and indeed that loneliness becomes cyclical. So it can be good or bad, depending on the ways that people use it. Another thing to talk about is that while we're talking about loneliness and perhaps the idea that people get lonely and then they move into a video gaming space, that's not just going to be a space where people either alleviate loneliness or become more lonely, because then they're entering into this space that, as we know, has a lot of problematic actors, has a lot of bad actors. And seeing as we're talking about masculinity directly, if we take the model that perhaps someone becomes, or a man becomes lonely, looks for a way to alleviate this stress of the loneliness because their masculinity doesn't allow them to really talk to people properly, and engages in video gaming, they might then come across these subcultures of geek masculinity, where men online begin to celebrate expertise, skill, and knowledge in playing video games to the exclusion, usually of women and of ethnic minorities as well. And if we're just talking about masculinities in general, we can talk about those masculinities which are more hegemonic, such as the traditional masculinities, which then also push out those men who perhaps don't meet those key standards. And those men are more likely to fall into geek masculinity when they encounter it as well. And of course, if we take the idea that if you become lonely and you kind of enter into a state of ressentiment, that you're more likely to lash out at people and more likely to engage in those toxic traits of masculinity as well, that's also going to align with the fact that, as we've discussed today, what we find in video game spaces a lot is sexism, homophobia, racism, and forms of extremism as well. So it's going to see someone who's already beginning to feel like these aspects of their character are forming into some kind of morally negative pool, finding them in a space where that kind of stuff exists and also is forming all around them. I put a little dot at the end there saying that, hey, we also know that there's recruitment, socialization, propaganda, and radicalization, which I don't think I need to talk about more. So the theoretical model that I'm looking to investigate is that there's loneliness. And in the ways that men try to alleviate loneliness is not by trying to build strong, vulnerable social connections with friends, but rather they seek to engage in stress management behavior. And video gaming is one of those stress management behaviors. That can lead to increased loneliness, and that can lead to increased ressentiment associated with loneliness as well, which is that negative emotion which gets pushed out onto other people, blaming them for that loneliness and looking for ways to punish them or making them feel lonely. So those people who engage in those kind of maladaptive behaviors are more likely to be people who, when they encounter extreme groups, would theoretically be those persons that recruitment efforts or radicalization efforts would be more effective for. Because they're already feeling that resentment, they're already feeling that sense of exclusion from society. They're already feeling that loneliness. And so a group can draw you in. And of course, we know that when people join extremist groups as true believers, then they do become less lonely. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to say that people who join Hizb ut-Tahrir, for instance, are not lonely people because they're constantly surrounded by people who are reinforcing their beliefs and making them feel good. But of course, those lonely men also have fewer protective factors. They have more negative emotions, both of which we know are vulnerabilities that can lead to recruitment or radicalization, but also because they're existing in a space where those negative toxic traits that are growing from ressentiment exist already, there's easier socialization with like-minded groups as well. You've got the manosphere, you've got the kind of Gamergate events, you've got red pill people, you've got incels. I notice I'm just out of time, so I do want to just finish up with a big however. And the however is, of course, that not everyone's going to engage in maladaptive coping mechanisms in gaming. Some people are going to engage in adaptive coping mechanisms, and they're going to seek to socialize rather than seek to kind of troll and make other people feel bad. And if they do that, that's going to lower their stress. That's going to also give them greater access to diverse social groups, which they might not have accessed before. And also just bringing back a bit more of the masculinity theory is going to provide them with a productive activity. And what we do know about male socialization is that we love to engage in productive activities to socialize with each other. If you look at older men trying to socialize with each other when they're out of work, successful projects have looked at creating sheds for them, for instance, to work together in. And as they work in these sheds, they socialize, they feel better. So it's this mediating space, really, that I think is important about video gaming. It could go either way. And that's important to highlight because it can be very, very productive. So the conclusion basically is the literature points to all these links. There's a link between traditional masculinity and loneliness, a link between loneliness and extremism, an idea that video gaming can exacerbate or mitigate loneliness, and also there are these communities in there that perhaps will target vulnerable people. So the final conclusion basically is that we perhaps need to be aware of all this. And as we collect the data and as I hopefully continue this little project, I'll get more data and I'll be able to speak about it more. But the final point is that actually video games can also be an extremely productive space. They can also be a space where all of these problems perhaps can become alleviated if we somehow manage to encourage the good actors and the good people in these spaces. Yeah, thank you.